The fluorescent kitchen light flickered, casting uneasy shadows on the walls. It was late, and the house felt like a place that held more secrets than comfort. I sat at the table, arms crossed, staring at my father, James, across from me. He held a mug of coffee that had been cold for hours. His expression was a mix of frustration and something harder to identify, an almost palpable resentment. "Lucas," he began, his tone grave and direct, "I need your help. If not now, everything will fall apart." The request had been made before, but this time it sounded more like a plea. My heart raced. James always had this authoritarian way that never left room for negotiation. Since my mother passed away 5 years ago, I felt the responsibility to be the perfect son, the one who did everything to keep things on track. But this was the first time he'd asked for something like this. "Dad, I understand, but..." My voice faltered as I tried to find words that wouldn't sound like betrayal. "This savings, it's all I have. I worked hard for it. It's for my future." James scoffed, leaning forward. "Future? What future will you have if this family goes bankrupt? Do you think I didn't care about your future when I paid your bills, your school, your college?" This conversation had been happening for weeks, but now it felt like an ultimatum. My father had made some bad business choices, and his hardware store was on the verge of bankruptcy. He needed money and fast, but the only money available was mine, the savings I started at 16, saving every penny from my part-time jobs and internships. "I'm not your last resort, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though my chest felt heavy. "You can talk to the bank, try for a loan." "I already tried," he interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "Do you think it's easy? Do you think I have another choice?" My mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. On one hand, the fear of seeing him lose everything. On the other, the anger at being treated like a walking wallet. My younger brother, Tyler, was never involved in these discussions. He was 20, still in college, and seemed untouchable in my father's eyes. It made the weight even heavier for me. "I can't do this, Dad," I said finally. The words barely escaped before he exploded. "You can't or you won't, because, to me, it seems like you're turning your back on your own family." I felt a lump in my throat. The man I had always admired now looked at me as if I were a stranger. "I've already given everything I could. I worked 2 jobs to pay for Mom's funeral when you were lost. And now you want me to abandon my future too." There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't the comfortable silence we sometimes shared. It was heavy, suffocating. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, but each word was like a punch. "If you refuse, Lucas, don't count on me ever again. I will never forgive you for this." His words pierced something inside me. He stood up, grabbed his coffee mug, and left the kitchen, letting the door slam behind him. I stood there, staring into the emptiness, fighting the urge to run after him while also feeling the need to stand my ground. The next few minutes were filled with the echo of the door and the hum of the light. My phone vibrated on the table, and the notification brought me back to the present. It was a message from Sarah, my best friend and the only person I felt comfortable sharing the weight I carried with. "Sarah, how are you? Something tells me you need to talk." I didn't know how to respond, how to explain the whirlwind of emotions that overwhelmed me. My vision blurred, and I realized I was holding back tears. As I fought against the feeling of despair, I heard footsteps again. It was Tyler, who came down the stairs with the carefree expression of someone who had no idea what was happening. He looked at me, then at the kitchen. "Again? What did he want now?" he asked, with a tone of irritation. I didn't answer. I didn't have the energy to argue with him too. Tyler sighed and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, as if nothing had happened. At that moment, one thing became clear to me. I was alone in this. Alone to make a decision that could cost me my relationship with my father or my own future. With a heavy heart, Lucas gets up and goes to his room. But before closing the door, he hears his father talking on the phone. "Don't worry, I'll get the money, even if it costs me my relationship with Lucas." Subliminal message in part 1. We introduce the protagonist's emotional dilemma, showing the manipulation and family pressure. The reader is left on edge, eager to know if Lucas will give in or face the emotional consequences of his decision. I'm so glad you liked it. Party Popper. The structure and emotional elements were carefully planned to achieve a strong impact on the reader. If you consider it 10 out of 10, it's because we managed to hit the right tone. Trophy. If you want to adjust or reinforce any aspect, such as intensifying the conflict or giving more sensory details, just let me know. Otherwise, I can move on to part 2 and maintain the same level of depth and drama. Smiling face with smiling eyes. I closed the bedroom door slowly, trying to muffle the sound of the click, but my head was too full to care about the silence. My father's words still echoed, "I'll get the money, even if it costs me my relationship with Lucas." I threw myself on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight as if an invisible weight had fallen on me. I knew he was desperate, but hearing that phrase cut me like a knife. Was that what I was worth to him? An obstacle he was willing to ignore to save his own pride? I picked up my phone and reread Sarah's message. For a moment, I considered simply ignoring her, but something in her tone told me she knew how much this was consuming me. He wants me to give up everything I have to save the business. Said he'll never forgive me if I don't. The reply came almost instantly. Sarah, that's not fair, Lucas. You know that, right? It's your savings, your effort. It's not your responsibility to fix his mistakes. I knew she was right, but still, the guilt was a shadow I couldn't shake off. Since my mother died, my life revolved around keeping my family afloat. I had never questioned it before, but now, was it wrong to finally think about myself? The next day, James left early, as he had been doing lately. I went downstairs and found Tyler on the sofa, with a bag of chips and the remote control in his hand. The TV was showing some reality show that he was watching without much interest. So, what's he going to do? Tyler asked without taking his eyes off the screen. What do you mean? You know, the old man. Is he going to get the money or is he going to leave us all in the lurch? I rolled my eyes. Tyler always had an impressive ability to avoid any kind of responsibility. He was the opposite of me. I spent my adolescence working 2 jobs while he went out to parties and trips. Maybe that's why my father never put him in the middle of difficult decisions. I don't know, Tyler. Maybe you should ask him instead of just watching from the sidelines. He laughed, without the slightest weight on his conscience. Relax, bro. You always find a way to solve things. That's what you do, right? I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Tyler by the shoulders and ask why I always had to be responsible for everything while he coasted through life on autopilot. But, as always, I swallowed my anger. Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Sarah. Hi, I answered, trying not to sound as dejected as I felt. Lucas, I need you to meet me at the coffee shop in an hour. There's something I want to tell you. I hesitated. My head was too full for conversations. But Sarah always knew how to pull me out of the hole, so I agreed. An hour later, we were sitting in a discreet corner of the local coffee shop. Sarah had a serious look that she rarely used. You need to hear this, and you're not going to like it, she began. But I'm going to say it anyway. I just nodded. Your father is manipulating you, Lucas. He's always done it, but now it's worse. Have you ever noticed how he uses guilt to control you? I swallowed hard. Her words hit like a punch because a part of me knew it was true. Since I was a teenager, James always had this ability to turn his problems into my problems. But until that moment, I had never named it. He's desperate, Sarah. Maybe he just doesn't know another way to ask for help. Don't justify his behavior, she retorted. You don't owe him anything. He had choices. He had years to fix what was wrong, and he didn't. Now he expects you to sacrifice everything you've built because he doesn't want to face the consequences. I was silent, stirring my coffee. It wasn't easy to admit that Sarah was right. And there's more, she continued, hesitating for a moment. Remember my uncle, that lawyer? I asked him what could happen to your father's store if he goes bankrupt. He said that, based on how it's registered, your father might lose the store, but not the house. He doesn't want to tell you that because he's trying to scare you. My eyes widened. The idea that James was hiding something so important made my mind spin. If he couldn't lose the house, then why the desperation? Sarah, are you sure about this? I am. And Lucas, please think about what I said. You're not wrong for prioritizing yourself. He's wrong for putting you in this position. I arrived home later, and the atmosphere was tense. James was in the living room, reviewing papers with a somber expression. He didn't even look at me as I passed by. But something in me had changed at that moment. I needed to know the truth. Dad, we need to talk, I said, stopping at the entrance to the living room. He sighed, without raising his head. If it's about the money, we've already talked about everything we had to talk about. Then explain something to me. I continued, trying to stay calm. You said you would lose everything, but what about the house? Isn't it protected? You didn't tell me that. He stopped writing. Slowly, he looked at me, his expression alternating between surprise and irritation. Who told you that? It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that you hid this from me. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, he said, I did what I thought was necessary, Lucas. And you're still here questioning me while everything falls apart. Anger took over me. I questioned you because you put me in an impossible situation. You want me to choose between my dignity and your approval, and that's not fair. James stood up, pointing his finger at me. If you can't understand what it means to support your family, maybe it's better to go your own way. Before I could respond, he grabbed his car keys and stormed out, leaving behind an even greater weight than what I was carrying before. I stood there, staring into the emptiness, wondering if there was anything that could save our relationship. The door slammed so hard that the sound reverberated through the house. The silence that followed felt like an abyss, deep and overwhelming. I remained standing, trying to process what had just happened. Was that it? Had my father really challenged me to choose between my sense of justice and what was left of our relationship? I went up to my room with heavy steps. With each step, I felt the emotional weight increase, as if I were carrying the responsibility for all his wrong choices. In the room, I threw myself on the bed and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, I felt an anger that came from deep within my chest. Not just at him, but at myself, for letting this go so far. My head was spinning with questions. How did I get here? Why did I always feel so responsible? Why had I never said no before? A few minutes later, the sound of shuffling footsteps in the hallway pulled me out of my trance. It was Tyler. He stopped at my bedroom door, holding a glass of juice. He freaked out, huh? Tyler said with a carefree tone, as if he were commenting on the weather. Did you hear? I asked without turning to face him. Of course, everyone heard. He practically declared war on you. But, it's kind of predictable. Dad has always been like that. Finally, I sat up and looked at Tyler. He was leaning against the door. His expression was that of someone who had zero intention of getting involved in the family drama. And you never said anything? Never did anything? Tyler shrugged. Why? You've always been the family hero. I knew he was going to ask you for help before he came to me. You've always solved everything, Lucas. And he's always known that. The anger inside me grew. But this time it wasn't just directed at my father. So, is that it? You just stayed there, in the shadows, letting everything fall on my lap while pretending this wasn't your problem. He crossed his arms, and for the first time I saw a glimpse of seriousness in his expression. You think I don't care, but the truth is I know how this ends. He pressures you, you give in, you solve everything, and he moves on. And you know what happens? You get stuck in this cycle while I'm the selfish guy. Sounds comfortable, doesn't it? Comfortable. My voice rose without me realizing it. Do you have any idea of the weight of this? Of what he just said to me? Ido. And that's exactly why I never get involved. You should try it. Tyler took a last sip of his juice and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts, which were now more chaotic than ever. The next day, I woke up early, but the house seemed deserted. Tyler was probably sleeping, and my father hadn't returned yet. I had a quick coffee, but the food seemed to lose its taste before it even reached my mouth. I picked up my phone and called Sarah. "Do you have a minute?" I asked as soon as she answered. "For you always. What happened now?" "He left last night, said I should go my own way, and he hasn't come back." "Lucas," Sarah sighed. "This isn't your fault. He's acting like a child because he didn't get what he wanted. But you know that, sooner or later, he'll come back. And when he comes back, what do? Pretend nothing happened? Try to solve everything again? No, you need to set boundaries. He only does this because he knows you always give in. Show him that you're not going to continue in this cycle." I knew Sarah was right, but just thinking about the idea of confronting my father again made my stomach churn. Around noon, I heard the familiar sound of my dad's car pulling into the driveway. My heart raced. I went to the window and saw James getting out of the car, looking even more dejected than he had the night before. He walked through the front door without a word, and I just stood there on the stairs, trying to decide what to do. He didn't go to the living room or the kitchen. He went straight to the office and slammed the door. It was a clear invitation. He didn't want to be bothered. I spent the whole day avoiding him, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. In the early evening, Tyler went out to meet friends, and the house became even quieter. Then, finally, I decided that I couldn't go on like this. I went up to the office and knocked on the door. "Dad, can we talk?" On the other side, I heard a heavy sigh. "Come in." I opened the door slowly. He was sitting in the leather chair, with piles of papers scattered across the desk. His eyes were tired, but there was still something cold in his expression. "I just want to clear a few things up," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. James stared at me, waiting. "I'm not your enemy. I don't want to see you go bankrupt or lose everything. But I also can't sacrifice everything I've worked for. It's not fair." He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Fair? You think life is fair, Lucas? I've worked my whole life to build something for our family. And now, when I need you, you say it's not fair. This isn't about fairness," I retorted, crossing my arms. "It's about you putting all the responsibility on me. You think you can manipulate the situation and force me to solve all your problems. But you can't." James stood up, the chair creaking beneath him. "Manipulate you? I just asked for help. You're the one turning this into a moral crusade. And you threatened to cut off our relationship because I wouldn't give in. How is that not manipulation?" The room fell silent. He stared at me, and for a moment I saw something different in his eyes. Shame. But he quickly looked away, returning to his defensive stance. "If I've lost the respect of my own son, then maybe there's nothing left to save," he said, his voice low but firm. Before I could respond, he brushed past me and left the office, leaving behind words as heavy as lead. This time, however, something had changed in me. For the first time, I felt that maybe I didn't need his forgiveness to move on. I stood in the doorway of the office, staring at the empty space where my father had been moments before. His words still swirled in my head. "If I've lost the respect of my own son, then maybe there's nothing left to save." It was strange how they had less impact than I expected. For years, I had feared disappointing him, but now it seemed that the emotional rope he used to hold me was beginning to fray. I sat in his chair, staring at the papers scattered across the desk. Financial reports, overdue invoices, and signed contracts. It was a chaos that reflected what he was trying to hide from all of us. I picked up one of the papers, a notice of bank account closure, and finally understood. He wasn't just fighting to save the store. He was fighting to save what was left of his self-confidence. But that didn't justify what he did. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected sound. The metallic noise of my father's hammer in the backyard workshop. He hadn't worked there in months. I felt a pang of curiosity. I grabbed a coffee and went to the window, where I could see him through the glass. There he was, alone, surrounded by tools and pieces of wood, hammering at something I couldn't identify. It was strange to see him like that, so focused, as if trying to forget everything that had happened. As I watched, I heard my phone vibrate on the table. It was Sarah. "Sarah, how are you doing today?" Anything new? I took a deep breath before replying. Me. He's still distant, but it seems like he's trying to find some distraction. He's in the workshop now. I don't know what it means. Sarah. Maybe it's a start, but don't be fooled. He still needs to understand that you're not wrong. Don't let that get lost. She was right. Something was changing in me, a sense of clarity that I had never felt before. My relationship with my father had always been shaped by the fear of disappointing him. But now, for the first time, I was starting to wonder, what about what I want? Later, I decided to go out for some fresh air. I put on my headphones and walked around the neighborhood. The leafless trees swayed in the cold wind, and the sidewalks were covered by a thin layer of snow. The streets were almost deserted, and that silence was the perfect setting for an avalanche of reflections. My mind went back to the day I decided to open my savings account. I was 16 years old and worked at a small restaurant as a kitchen helper. Every dollar I saved was a small triumph, a reminder that I was building something for myself. That savings wasn't just money. It was proof that I could have an independent future. But now, my father wanted me to give it all up. As I walked, I felt a growing anger. Not against him, but against the idea that I always had to carry the weight of other people's choices. I needed to break this cycle. When I got back home, I found Tyler in the kitchen, eating cereal straight from the box. "You've been gone," he commented casually. "Needed some air," I replied, taking off my coat. He looked at me for a moment, as if deciding whether to say something more serious. "Are you going to keep fighting with him?" "I don't want to fight, Tyler. I just want him to understand that he can't throw all of this on me." Tyler nodded slowly. "Yeah, I don't think he'll ever understand. You know, Dad has always been the type who thinks responsibility is a debt that never ends. And you, well, you've always been the easiest to blame." That observation, although harsh, made sense. I had always wanted to be the son who did everything right. But now it was clear that, for my father, that wasn't enough. That night, I went to his office again, but this time he wasn't there. The hammer still echoed in the backyard. I went to the back door and looked into the workshop. He was there, standing, looking at a shelf full of old tools. "Dad," I called, my voice cutting through the silence. He turned slowly, his face marked by tiredness and, perhaps, something more, regret. "What is it now, Lucas?" "I just wanted to talk to you," I said, entering the workshop. "I wanted you to know that I don't hate you for asking for help, but you need to understand that what you did wasn't fair." He sighed, dropping the hammer on the workbench. "I was desperate. I still am. I can't sleep, I can't think about anything else. Everything I've built, it feels like it's slipping through my fingers. And I understand that, Dad. I really do. But you're asking me to sacrifice everything I've built too. That doesn't solve anything. It just transfers the weight." There was a long silence between us. He finally sat on an old stool and ran his hands over his face. "I was wrong, Lucas. I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have said that." Those words took me by surprise. He never admitted mistakes. Never. "I don't know how to fix this," he continued. "But I also don't know how to move on if I lose the store. It's all I have." "No, it's not," I replied, sitting on a stool next to him. "You have me. You have Tyler. Even if the store is gone, we're still here. But this will only work if you stop trying to solve things at the expense of others." He didn't answer immediately. We sat there for minutes that felt like hours, listening to the distant sound of the wind outside. The next morning, he called me to the office. When I went in, he was holding a folder with organized papers. "I'm going to try something else," he said, looking at me. "I talked to the bank again. Maybe they'll agree to renegotiate the terms. And I won't ask for your money anymore." I felt a weight lift off my back, but at the same time, something told me that this wouldn't be an easy road for him. "Thank you, Dad. Really." He nodded, still serious. "I still want to fix things between us, but I know it's going to take time." "It will," I agreed. "But it's a start." As I left the office, I heard Tyler in the hallway, saying, "So, did he finally understand? Or is this just the beginning of another battle?" The days that followed that conversation in the workshop were different. Not perfect, but different. My father, James, began to avoid the heavy silences that used to dominate our days. He was more focused on solving problems and less consumed by the despair that had previously seemed to guide his actions. I noticed it in the small gestures. He no longer looked at me with that mixture of anger and expectation. There was something new in his gaze. A reluctant, but sincere, acceptance that not everything depended on me. One morning, when I went down for coffee, I found Tyler sitting on the sofa with the remote control in his hand, flipping through channels without much attention. He looked up and gave me a lazy smile. "Dad left early today," he commented. "He said he had an important meeting with the bank manager." I nodded, feeling a wave of silent relief. He was really taking the renegotiation seriously. The weight I was carrying seemed, for the first time, to be more his than mine. "Do you think he'll make it?" I asked. Tyler shrugged, as always. "I don't know, but I think the important thing is that he's trying, you know? It's been a long time since I saw him so determined." I agreed, although something in me still held back. It wasn't skepticism, but maybe a protection. Learning to say no also means learning not to carry unrealistic expectations, even when you want to believe in the best. That afternoon, when I got home from work, I found my father in the workshop. He was hunched over the workbench, focused on a project. The smell of wood and varnish filled the air. "Dad," I called hesitantly. He looked up and smiled slightly, something rare coming from him. "Oh, Lucas, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to show you something." I approached as he picked up a small object from the shelf next to him. It was a wooden box, simple, but with detailed carvings on the sides. "I made this for you," he said, handing me the piece. "It's not much, but I thought you deserved something that was just yours." I took the box, feeling the light weight in my hands. It was delicate, but made with care. I ran my fingers over the carvings, realizing the time he must have dedicated to each detail. "Thank you, Dad," I replied sincerely. "It means a lot." He nodded, looking at the workbench as if he were choosing his next words carefully. "I know we still have things to work out. I'm not perfect, and I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I want to improve. I want to do better for you and Tyler." I was silent for a moment, letting those words settle in. It was the closest thing to an apology he had ever made. In the following days, something curious began to happen. My father started to share more about the progress of the store, something he never did before. He told me about the meeting with the bank, about how he managed to renegotiate the terms of the loan. "It's going to be difficult," he said one night, while we were in the living room, "but I think I can keep the store running without needing your money." Those words were like a confirmation of everything I needed to hear. He not only recognized my limits, but was willing to face them head-on, without blaming me. "I'm glad to hear that, Dad," I replied. "Really?" He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a slight smile on his face. Moments of reflection. Meanwhile, I also began to reflect on everything that had happened. I realized that setting boundaries wasn't just about saying no. It was about protecting who I am and what I've built. It was about understanding that my life also has value, and that helping others is only possible when you don't destroy yourself in the process. Tyler, of course, continued at the same relaxed pace as always, but even he seemed to notice the changes. One night, while we were in the kitchen, he made a comment that caught me by surprise. "Did you know that Dad respects you more now?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, laughing. He never used to say the things he's saying now. He never admitted when he was wrong. "You made that happen, Lucas. Even if it doesn't seem like it, he's changing because of you." I was silent, thinking about Tyler's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe, by finally setting my boundaries, I had forced my father to face his own. And you know what's funny? As I look back, I see how this journey has shaped me. Facing my father's expectations was one of the biggest challenges of my life, but it also gave me something I never had before: clarity about who I am and what I want to be. It's these stories, these lessons, that make me think about how small decisions can transform everything. That's exactly what fascinates me about real narratives. How they show us that, even in the midst of chaos, we can find ways to grow. By the way, if you like this kind of story, of exciting journeys that reflect real life, you'll love the content of Moving Narratives. It's where we find these lessons hidden in everyday struggles and show how they make us stronger. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to follow new stories. We always have something special coming up, and I know you'll identify with a lot of what we share. Maybe this is just one more story, or maybe it's the beginning of many others to come.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.